Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Edwin Hill. I'm an associate professor, joint appointed in the departments of French and Italian and the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Black Lives Matter Beyond Borders, a three-part lecture series that thinks about how social justice, questions of anti-Black racism, questions of police brutality, mass incarceration, systemic racism, and the criminalization of Black bodies takes place around the world. For those who don't know, this lecture series comes in the context of a course I'm teaching right now entitled Black Europe. And one of the interesting things I think we've started to notice throughout the course is that the struggle over anti-Blackness is in many ways an anti-colonial struggle because it's still a struggle over space in a lot of different ways. The statue that you see behind me exemplifies the kind of struggle over space that's taking place in the Italian context now, as people are questioning statues, questioning certain mythologies of Italian national identity. And because of these dynamics of space and Italian cultural history, which is not my specialty at all, I'm very excited to have today Heather Merrill, a professor of Africana Studies at Hamilton College. Her research focuses on intersectional dynamics of anti-Black racism in Italy, in the borderlands and the spatial imagination. And she also thinks about the entanglements of African and European history, Italian politics, we could say also activism, and African migration. A trained geography, she grounds her work in ethnography, and she's recently published a wonderful book entitled Black Spaces, African Diaspora in Italy. And, one of the amazing things that I've learned from reading this project is that she shows us how the anti-Black and anti-immigrant structures of feeling that are sort of sedimenting in Italian culture right now are animating a symbolic violence that takes place every day on public streets. And one of the things that I find really compelling in her work is that she discusses this as something that not only ignores Italian histories of relationships with Africa, but it also, in many respects, sort of actually corrodes forms of sociality and hospitality that are actually deeply constitutive of Italian culture, right? So it's not only an ignorance of history, in many respects, it's a kind of perversion of Italian culture and history, right? So there's a lot that's taking place. She helps us understand this within the context of the last few decades when the cultural, ethnic, and racial landscapes of Italy have been transforming. So all of this to say, I've been really enjoying the book. I'm really excited to welcome our final guest in the lecture series, Professor Heather Merrill. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Professor Hill. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me to this exciting and extremely important series. And I want to thank you, first of all, to begin by thanking you and thank the French and Italian Studies Department for giving me this opportunity. It's a highly valuable series, very important to talk about Black lives and this, especially in this troubling time in our history. And our present. And it's also a promising time, I think, of racial reckoning, which even in spite of the day. And right. the way I see it, we're at an historical turning point, and when a number of converging tragedies right. have pushed us to think more carefully about racism as another global pandemic.
Wow.
And about how the unresolved problems of white supremacy and systems of anti-Black racism are part of the fabric and the daily workings of modern democracies and democratic societies. And I think it's morally and socially damaging, the system of white supremacy and the racialized privileges that go along with it, that we have not yet grappled with those on this side of the Atlantic, and certainly not on the other side. And I'm deeply grateful to you and to your department and to USC for giving me this opportunity to talk with you about my work and to participate in this discussion. So
well, it's our pleasure. It's our pleasure.
here we go. So here we were. And I said, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for being here today. Appreciate it. This is a really hard day for a lot of us. I want to just say that at the outset.
Amen.
We're exhausted, we're drained, and we've reached the moment of reckoning in this country. There's no question about that. And the world's looking to us for guidance. And we feel angry.
Yikes.
And, we feel angry, and we feel sad, and we feel, worried, and it's a very uncertain moment, but the struggles would have continued no matter what, even if things had turned out differently than we had hoped they had turned out, like for today, if what we had dreamed of happening today had turned out that way, we still have struggles. So the struggles, I just want to say that at the outside, since this is such an extraordinary moment in this country and in history of the world, really, because we're so important for the rest of the world. The world always looks to us for guidance. We still have these struggles, and we would be continuing to have these struggles. And I think there's a lot of hopeful convergences going on, even with what's happening now. The young people all over the world are participating and thinking quite differently and in new ways. And we have the global reach of this movement is nothing but good. And we are working towards better and truer democracies together. So I just want to say it's not over. I know you might all be feeling some despair. Don't despair. And think about the moms that came in Seattle, for instance, right? And I think we've started something, but it's going to be a marathon, and we're in this together. I think that's what's important here. So I also want to say one thing about Italy, because Italy is in a COVID crisis at this moment, and our hearts go out to them. They've just, shut down a number of regions. So I'm going to tell you first what I'm going to talk about. Take a look at this. This is what today's conversation. Italian colonialism, as you just mentioned, Professor Hill, is what I'm going to actually start out talking about, and just briefly say something about what I mean by Black spaces. And then I want to talk a little bit about the politics of mourning and the rise of a Black diasporic solidarity, and then maybe what, if any, sort of racial reckoning is happening in Italy right now. And if there's time, I had other things that I could talk about having to do with why I'm an anti-racist scholar and influences in the Black intellectual tradition in particular, and my methodology. But so, as you know, I study the African diaspora in Italy, and I would like to start with talking about Italy and Africa. The movement of people from parts of Africa to Italy today, and their presence in Italy and Italian daily life really can't, I don't think, be understood without examining the imperial connections. And it's not widely known, actually, that Italy colonized Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Libya. And it did so with quite a bit of brutality. And that colonialism transformed the world and the worlds and the subjectivities of the colonized, and also of the colonizer. Everyone involved conceives of themselves and the world around them, creating hybrid and diasporic identities and cultures. The legacies of violence and intimacy in this colonial history are carried forward into the present. And the growing presence and participation of people of African descent in Italian society, in a sense, brings this story all back home. It represents a history that's turning back on itself. And there's a compelling need to explore the diasporic worlds and the subjectivities produced through the Italian presences in North and East Africa. Now, I'm reminded of one of my friends and research informants about the deep relationship between Italy and Somalia. While growing up in Somalia, she studied in Italian-operated mission schools. She was called Nurta, which means nice in Arabic. And one day, the nuns baptized her, and they gave her the name Giovanna Zaldini. without asking for her mother's consent. And they named everybody in the classroom that day. So the woman I know is Giovanna. She moved to Italy when she was after her high school, and in order to attend university, and through the mediation of a Catholic priest. And she married a man she went to Turin, and she married a Piedmontese man, which is the region there, and whom she met at the university. And when in the late 1980s and the early 90s, African migrants began to arrive in greater numbers in the country and in Turin, she became part of a group that were researching labor issues with the Ires Piemonte. And she realized more than ever that her husband didn't have a clue about who she was in terms of her Africanness and her history. She'd been married to him for 15 years. She had 2 children with him, and yet he did not know that she was Black, and which is a gloss for African. And I heard about this from a mutual friend who was Italian, who used the word Black. So she's now lived most of her life in Italy, and her Italian's impeccable, at least in my view. And so when she speaks to people on the phone, she never tells them that she's Somalian right away. And she still self-identifies as Somalian. And when they see her, they find it shocking, and it jars and confounds their system of mental categorization, because they still expect people who look like her are unable to command Italian. But her relationship to Italy is rooted in the Italian colonization of Somalia. And she, like so many others, lives through the various presences produced by this past that are like shadows cast on the present. In spite of such lived experiences and lived social complexities, when the subject of Italian colonization of parts of Africa arises, many Italians react with incredulity, and/or they openly dismiss the idea that colonization represents a significant part of the Italian story. There's this prevailing myth of Italian innocence surrounding Italian colonialism, or just innocence, and it licenses the avoidance of serious discussion and scrutiny. Well, over the past several decades, the histories of Italian colonization of Africa have been excavated by scholars. They've produced some great material that is not, however, widely discussed. Italian colonial history is not taught in school, and there is a persistently deafening silence around the topic that contributes to the difficulty that I've observed in Italy in understanding and explaining the presence of people of African origins and what many perceive as their right to be seen as participants and people with rights in civil society, and not complete outsiders or others in Italian cultural and political spheres or spaces. The truth is that Italian colonization was quite meaningful and impactful, and it connected and intertwined Italian with African economies, societies, and cultures in ways that can't be undone, and that must be reckoned with. Italians were as interested in national power and prestige as any other European empire, and their aggressive movements into Libya and East Africa are part of an unfinished history that continues to shape lived experiences in the present. Stuart Hall's prudent words when talking about British imperial history in the context of immigration to England from the Caribbean can be applied to the Italian context as well. Stuart Hall said, "Unpurged, the imperial moment remains the discursive shadow of the nation's self-image. These matters still have a long, unfinished history." Here's the quote. "Without reckoning with imperial colonial histories, white Europeans, including Italians, will continue to act with what Dinke Hondius called the repetition of surprise to describe what happens when white people first meet Africans in the Netherlands and express a sense of shock that they're there. The danger in this reaction, specifically in Italy, is that it repeats a habit of perceiving Europe as exclusively white and erases from consciousness the long historical entanglements. Knowing about the workings of these unequal relationships of power also helps to explain the racism exhibited in current Italy. The historical relationship between Italy and Africa seems to be a difficult history for Italians to learn, but it's a crucial issue. Italy, which is part of Europe, inhabited the European interests in laying siege to Africa's labor and natural resources. Through their imperial colonial connections, Italy and its colonies became relationally intertwined spaces as dominant and subjugated subjects, not as associates in a shared business, in their very inequalities, differences, and destinies. As Stuart Hall said, I repeat, I don't think that Italy or its former colonies in Africa can be understood without considering the moment of colonialism and imperialism and the impacts on those who lived under their authority. The patterns of encounter, conquest, greed, and hubris that drove the colonizers on, the implantation of Italian language, culture, and institutions that followed, often extremely violent intrusions of conquest, and the conflicting cultures of nostalgia and resentment that these antagonisms wrought live on in the present. Now, I finally want to say that I know there are many people who don't like to think of Italy as racist. Italy is a place that's been seen as filled with brava gente, good people who are friendly and welcoming to strangers. I understand, I love Italy too. But Italy's part of Western and Mediterranean Europe, a Europe that generated and remained deeply invested in the transatlantic slave trade and that colonized a large part of the world, including most of Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. Another argument that's frequently invoked to argue that Italy is not anti-Black is that the country has a fragile national unity rooted in local cultures, and not everyone is considered white in Italy. That's what they say. And Italians are just, quote, ignorant about differences. They're not racist. I believe these arguments facilitate popular denial of the lived experiences of anti-Black racism among African migrants, African refugees, African Italians, or some people prefer to be called Italian Africans, and denial of the racial resentment that I've witnessed. We need to keep in mind, too, that Italy is a country that gave rise to fascism in Europe. And one of the distinguishing features of fascism is the idea of the ethno-racist superiority of white Aryan people. In 1994, Italy was the first country to bring a neo-fascist party back into power as part of Silvio Berlusconi's government. And while Italy doesn't generally come to mind when one talks about scientific racism, Cesare Lombroso, who theorized white supremacy, basically, they produced Cesare Lombroso, who was one of the most influential racial scientists of the 19th century, and he theorized white supremacy and also argued that Southern Italians were a distinct atavistic race. The racially hierarchical system of Western knowledge renders it unthinkable that the colonized would be considered as part of the same human family as the colonizer. This binary opposition between races as a categorization continues to be taken for granted, even and including in Italy. I've witnessed the interweaving of and the complexity of identities and subjectivities over and over again while in Italy among first and second generation African Italians. People of the first generation seem to experience what Stuart Hall called multiple coexisting presences, from Aimé Césaire, that notion of presences, or interweaving of their memories and sensibilities derived from Somalia, Ethiopia, Senegal, or Kenya, and Italy. People of the second generation inherit traces of these memories and sensibilities secondhand, passed to them by their parents, and compelled in many instances by a society that categorizes them as not genuinely Italian, as permanent outsiders. Scholars and students of Italian culture and society are today calling for reflection on the decolonization of Italian studies, looking for methods with which to rethink the curricula, for instance, in higher education, and how it's taught in order to better represent the multiculturality of Italian society. This is promising. It's a promising turn, and I hope it's going to give way to new fields of inquiry and transformation. Okay. Now I'll tell you about Black spaces. Is the title of the book. I developed this approach in order to capture the lived experiences of African Italians in Italian spaces, as well as the habit of erasing them from local spaces. This approach was inspired in part by my meeting in 2010 in Turin, a group of Somali women refugees, and listening to their horrific stories of survival in Somalia and their struggles for survival in Italy. Then I visited several abandoned buildings in residential neighborhoods that had been occupied in Turin, that refugees had occupied because they were otherwise homeless. And I realized that these spaces that were filled with living human beings were part of a recent African diaspora were in effect, as I was looking around, ignored. Sort of like the way we tend to look away when we see homeless people, but also racialized, informed by the way we perceive others based on racial classifications and racial hierarchies. And I thought about the CIA's Black sites that are surrounded by silences, and how systems of anti-Black racism work by teaching us that whiteness is a symbol of humanness and Blackness is its opposite, or underbelly. What this does, in effect, is to erase from the field of vision the very real and human lives that these African refugees are living, and even erase that they are being erased. Another way of saying this is that there's a powerful narrative that Europe is a colorblind continent, and yet the only color that is treated consistently with dignity and the full rights of humanity is the color white, if that's a color. Philosopher Charles Mills has argued that white supremacy involves an epistemology of ignorance in which whiteness and white dominance involves cognitive dysfunctions that yield the outcome that whites will be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. Now, I read the work of Charles Mills after I had begun writing this last book, and I found that it supported and helped me clarify some of what I was trying to explain. I called this habit of not seeing, not engaging, not thinking, trivializing, and not knowing Black spaces with a small b, in order to distinguish the dominant forms from the lived experiences of Black subjects who, in Italy, are beginning to develop a sense of themselves as a group across enormous differences of ethnic origins, thus Black with a capital B. They're doing this in a number of ways, pushing back and creating ways to thrive in what is frequently a hostile environment. Under this broader theoretical frame, I explain colonial spaces, the symbolic violence of everyday interactions in urban spaces and their responses to them, and bus spaces, for instance, and the production of Black consciousness, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, and spaces of the crossing, and spaces occupied by refugees. So I'm going to tell you about Sylvester. This is one of the chapters in my book. So one of the chapters in this book is titled The Death of Sylvester Agyemang. Can You Be Black and Bear This? After scholar and poet Elizabeth Alexander's seminal essay, Can You Be Black and Look at This? Reading the Rodney King videos, in which Alexander explores the sense of Black group identification as it is consolidated around incidents of psychic and physical violence, like the videotape beating of Rodney King Jr. and the memories that it fosters. In my chapter, I also explored the rise of a consciousness of Blackness in Italy, a Black collective consciousness, specifically around the tragic death of 14-year-old Sylvester Agyemang in Reggio Emilia in January 2014. Okay. I first want to say that the category Black is politically and culturally constructed, and it is continually in a state of becoming, meaning that it cannot be fixed. It's also important to know that among Black subjects, people of African descent in Italy, and it's also important to know that among Black subjects, people of African descent in Italy, there's considerable variation in terms of ethnic and national origins and identifications. Most migrants from Africa can become, if they'd like to, become members of ethnic or cultural associations of their countries of origin. This system has tended to reinforce and construct ethnic or national differences for good and for not good, and undermine group solidarity. It can undermine group solidarity, not because they want to do it and they're undermining their own solidarity necessarily, but it was also something that the Italian state was interested in promoting at the beginning, because, I've been doing this for 30 years. So they started doing this quite a long time ago in 1990, which is when I started doing this research. Anyway, the system has tended to reinforce these things. And, these are things that people talk about now, is the fact that there are these kinds of divisions. But from the early 1990s, many subjects of African descent have also built interethnic associations and work cooperatives, more in the diasporic sense of them, and circumventing and contesting divisions in favor of more open expressions of collective purpose and solidarity. So today, Blackness is becoming a broad term of unification that's emerging. And it's allowing people to coalesce and to form new spaces of Italianness that intersect with Africanness. The tragic loss of Sylvester Agyemang while he was getting off a school bus gave rise to a collective Black group self-definition and self-knowledge. I mean, it existed somewhat before that, but this really brought it together in this small city in the north central Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, Reggio Emilia. At the time that he died, social anger about the influx, just in terms of the context, of Africans and other non-Europeans into Italy was at a high pitch. There were representations of boats with refugees crossing the Mediterranean from Libya to the Italian island of Lampedusa or Sicily, they had supplanted to an extent the previous representations that had been dominant of prostitutes, African prostitutes and street sellers. They had come to signify Africans and Africanness in the 90s and in the early 2000s in the press in particular, and therefore a lot in the popular imaginary. So the empathy that some Italians had initially exhibited toward these refugees when they heard about their plight, for instance, after the major tragedy that happened in the Mediterranean crossing in 2013, this had already begun immediately after this to evaporate, and they were and refugees were increasingly seen as a threat. Okay, so in the early winter morning of January 13th, Sylvester was on a jumbo bus, which looked like this, packed with his classmates, when his bus, and this is the bus stop actually, his bus stopped in order to allow the young students to exit. Sylvester was the last student to get off. And while he was doing so, the driver closed the door on him, catching his backpack in the door and violently flinging Sylvester to the sidewalk, where his head hit the pavement. Classmates screamed at the driver as this was unfolding, but he drove on, as did a second passing bus driver. Minutes passed before Sylvester received any help, too late in any case to save his life. Okay, so who was he? He was the eldest child of Augustina and Emmanuel Agyemang, who were from Ghana. And he was 14 years old, and he had spent most of his life in Reggio Emilia. His father came first to Reggio Emilia, and he secured a job and a residence, and then he was the oldest child of this family. There were 3 other children when Sylvester was, I believe, 5 years old. Sylvester played several musical instruments, and he had dreams of becoming a police officer because he wanted to protect and help people. At his funeral, a family member described Sylvester as a young man who so strongly wished to communicate with others that he had learned Italian very rapidly. One said, "Sylvester had the desire to learn and to be accepted by others." When Sylvester's shocked and heartbroken parents learned of the incident, they and other family members and classmates transformed the site of his death into a small memorial, an expression of outrage. They laid flowers, candles and notes, hung a large banner with a school photograph reading "Ciao Sylvester," like the one you see there, and a banner. There was another banner on the side that stated in Italian, "Killed like animals. These things only happen here in Reggio." The reference to what happens in Reggio was aimed more at the packed school bus operated by the Seta Spa bus company than the fact that Sylvester was the only student of African origin in his class. And his death, getting off a bus, was that they didn't wonder if this was suspicious as well as outrageous. Other parents expressed their horror about what had happened, and they focused blame on the fact that the bus was overcrowded, and they blamed, again, the bus company, and they blamed the municipal government. Students from all the local schools were also outraged, and they organized a school walkout in order to express their feeling of horror and to join the Agyemang family in demanding a full investigation. Following his death, there was an outpouring of support. Yes, just following his death, there was an outpouring of support, and there were new possibilities sort of for cultural and political activities from, I think these represented from within the diverse population of African descent. A march filled the streets, and it was with high school students and others, a lot of parents and teachers. There were a lot of community members that were at this march in the rain on a rainy day. And there was also a ceremony at the high schools, and a procession, one of the high schools, and a procession to the site of Sylvester's death to commemorate the spot with a small plaque. And I'd like to show you, if I can. This is the plaque. And if I can show you this, I would like to show you this. I hope you can hear it. There's no sound. Okay. Now I have to now I have to go back to sharing my PowerPoint, right? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Oh boy. This is not, yeah.
Yeah, if you've never done it, sometimes you don't know how many different things you're navigating on the screen. Okay, yeah, there it goes.
All right, cool. Well, that wasn't tremendously horrible, but so you saw that. I just wanted you to see the clips. It didn't have any sound, and there was, so, and here we go. Okay, here. So there was the newspapers reported that the DA, the district attorney, was investigating the bus driver for negligent homicide, and also wrongful death, and for failing to stop and assist and report an accident. And the second driver was also being investigated for wrongful death for being an accessory to a criminal act. The driving license of the man presumed to have driven the bus was suspended, and he was removed from his driving position at the bus company, while he, however, remained on the payroll in an office job. Now, the story was gripping to me. I had just arrived right a few days before this all happened to spend 7 months, what was to be 7 months in Reggio Emilia. And the story was really gripping, partly because I had seen bus drivers closing doors on passengers of African descent countless times, especially in Turin. The driver must have known that Sylvester had not fully exited the bus when he closed the door. School children always wear backpacks in Italy, and this was an act. This was an act of aggression, likely motivated by anger or hatred, and that was my reading of it. And yet, not once did any resident I spoke with or any local newspaper report that racial animus might have underlined the tragedy. There was sympathy, especially among young students in Reggio Emilia, who marched along with family members and hundreds of local residents to demand an investigation. But the loss of young Sylvester seemed to have hit young people of African descent the hardest, across ethnic differences, igniting a sense of deep mourning and expressions of African diasporic solidarity. This is a politics that arose from mourning, informed by an awareness of the precarity of their status in Italy. They arranged for a local street artist to paint a large portrait of Sylvester at the bus stop. This is it, a visual reminder that Sylvester had been part of this town and community. And the Ivorian Youth Association, which had become a multi-ethnic association, predominantly of African origin, organized a memorial dinner and a ceremony for the family at the Monde Insieme, which is an intercultural center in Reggio. Participants were from Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Congo, Burkina Faso, Eritrea, and Cameroon. Assistant mayor, Luca Vecchi, who was now the mayor, and became mayor shortly after this, 2 school teachers, members of the Chinese Association and the Albanian Association, which are 2 of the largest ethnic associations in the city. They were also there. The lead organizer was a young man whose parents were from the Ivory Coast, but he had been born in Italy and had never visited the Ivory Coast. And he opened the ceremony by saying that this dinner had been organized for the African community of Reggio to express collective support and solidarity to Sylvester's family. The meal had been prepared by members of the community and included Ivorian, Togolese, Cameroonian, and Moroccan dishes. After the meal, which was delicious, and I was asked repeatedly if I liked it, where people gave speeches, including the assistant mayor and Sylvester's teacher. And then the family said a few words, and there was some singing by a man who was playing a guitar, and he sang in Lingala, which is a language of the Congo. I'm saying Congo, but it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as I call it now. But the song was popular, and many of the people that were there sang with him. They didn't know the words, but they sang. It was a popular song. So the ceremony was just one event in an ongoing series of gatherings of people from across the African diasporic origins who collectively mourned Sylvester and forged collective Black identification. A few months later, the group had organized another event in honor of Sylvester, which was a soccer game. The family and their networks of support, many from the Pentecostal churches to which they belonged, organized periodic demonstrations through the city demanding justice. Okay, now I have another clip, but I don't know if I'm worried about taking too much time, but I will show it at the end if we have time for it, okay? Because I have that clip and you can see I thought I could do it right through here, and I had tested it. And it's working for me, but you can't see it. So it doesn't matter whether it works for me or not, does it? So I will continue and we'll skip it, but it shows the father is there, and there are lots of other people that are there. This is 4 months after, and they're protesting in the street and they're demanding justice. And they're saying it in English, and they're also in Italian. And in also a language, which is a Ghanaian language, okay? Yeah. So this is so yeah, I was showing you this clip, which so yeah. And so this is, you know, people of African descent in Reggio, for the tragic loss of Sylvester really made a very strong mark. I skipped the part, sorry about that. Okay, the large painting of Sylvester that was painted by the street artist some months after his death remained there untouched for years, memorializing this young man as a permanent part of this small city and asserting his belonging. Okay. However, in 2019, January 2019, you can see here, as resentment towards newcomers was on the rise again, or consistently on the rise, because it's been that way for quite a number of years, even in places like Reggio Emilia that have been associated with the left since after the Second World War, someone defaced the image. And this was denounced by Sylvester's family. And also the mayor. The mayor's office, who was the counselor at the dinner for Sylvester's family, he responded very quickly and identified and arrested the man who had destroyed the image, and they contracted a replacement. And this is it being painted. And they invited the family, who had moved to lives in England now, and the father returned at the unveiling of this just recently. This was, I have the date wrong here. It's July 19th, 2019. I have the date wrong. So the death of Sylvester basically left a mark on this small city that it can't be easily eradicated. His death and mourning sparked a watershed moment in the coming of age of a second generation of Black Italian youth, and the emergence in this community of a broad configuration of solidarity that wasn't there before. For this generation, both a path back to Africa and a path ahead to Italian belonging appeared rocky and perhaps closed to them. But when they gathered together across ethnic differences, along with diverse generations and representatives of key institutions within Italian society, they did so with love and commitment. The great crowds of protesters who marched along with them, initially in an expression of outrage, also pretended that the future wasn't closed, is not closed in this society, not entirely, no. And as one of those who participated in the initial demonstrations wrote in a sign, "No one ever dies if they love on in the lives of those who remain." Basically, that's the message. And the mural that features the large image of 14-year-old Sylvester is a living testament to his impact on this small city, something that in Italy, where painting and architecture are so salient in the cultural and historical imaginary, this is really quite meaningful. And for people of African descent in Reggio, the tragic loss of Sylvester also made an indelible mark, and one that we might say signaled, like I said, a turning point. And we might also say that Sylvester's untimely death, upon his death, people began to realize that people in the diaspora, that there wasn't any point in really pursuing a politics of assimilation, that they had to create for themselves something that they might call their own, something out of their lives in Italy and life in Africa by launching diasporic initiatives. They also are making themselves significant within this broader structure of Italian society, and they are. This Black diasporic is part of the fabric of Italian society, and with the painting and mural of Sylvester, and this is a centrally located place in Reggio Emilia, this African diaspora asserts that they're there and that they're part of this world. We see this in Reggio all the time, and many of the other spaces of the city where people of African descent walk and bicycle all the time down the main arteries of the city, past the various shops and through the piazzas while they're talking on phones, while they're in small groups, or while they're walking alone. They're part of the city. And they shop in the grocery stores and the open markets, and they hang out in the groups and piazzas, in groups of people in the piazzas, and they ride the buses, and they assert their rights to be there. They want to be seen as people, generally speaking, who belong there, but they're aware of the precarious status of Black life in Italy. There's also a radio program right now that features discussions of Black lives and in the city and throughout the country. There's a growing effort to confront anti-Black racism in all its manifold forms in a variety of ways, including through fashion. There's a new magazine I was just reading before I came online, just started in March, and it's the second issue, by producing new products for the market. Camilla Hawthorne, who teaches at UC Santa Cruz, has just written a book which addresses some of this as well. It hasn't come out yet, it's in process, but it'll be out soon. There are also a growing number of online forums about Black life. There's a lot of literature, including Afrofuturist literature. There's music, there's dance, there's art, there's film. For instance, the documentary filmmaker, Fred Cornu, who's written about actors and actresses, or written about one of his films is about representations of Africans and their people of African descent who are now Italian or who were born in Italy and have lived nowhere else but there and are trying to be represented in films. Anyway, Fred Cornu is a great filmmaker who's also doing some great work. So this is the conclusions. I want to ask, is there a moment of reckoning in Italy right now? What kind of reckoning is happening in Italy right now? As you know, the murders of George Floyd, along with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, sparked protests in the United States and throughout the world, in spite of and during a coronavirus pandemic, which we're still experiencing. In Italy, too, thousands of Italians, most but not all of them young, filled urban piazzas to express outrage and solidarity against systemic racism all over the country. In Turin, Torino, call it, last June, there was a sit-in. This is the image of that, and there was 8 minutes of silence. It's a big, beautiful piazza. There were about 2,000 people there, was estimated. And protesters held signs that's in English and Italian stating, Black Lives Matter. No freedom till we're equal. Love you all in caps. I can't breathe. Mio fratello, George Floyd, my brother, George Floyd. And il silenzio è violenza, which is silence is violence. They chanted the freedom cry, no justice, no peace. A young woman of African descent stated in an interview that I want to be able to show you a clip of, but anyway, you wouldn't, just to see her and, and the people being interviewed and some of the rest of it. She stated that she felt very strong emotions, but what hit her the most was seeing all those people there because she'd never seen them in solidarity with them before. And she hoped they would stay by their side because there's a need for many people like this to participate in all the battles, in everyone's battles for people's value and dignity. She said that every neighborhood in Turin had its own expression of racism, but she thought there was a need to confront it. Another young woman whose parents are from Somalia stated that she felt finally, and for the first time in her life, that Turin was her city. She always felt alone growing up as a Black girl, and she and so many others like her never felt listened to. And that day, there in Italy and in the world, everything was changing. Another young woman whose I just said that, yeah. So here, I can't show you the clip. I would like to, yes, but it's just going to take too long. So this is what I'm going to say. This demonstration with over 2,000 people was, let me go backwards now. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's pretend we're seeing that clip right now. This demonstration with over 2,000 people was organized by Black women, and it was intended to elevate the voices of Black Italians who face racism in Italy. In an article about Black women in Italy and the Black Lives Matter protests published in The Lily, which is the name of the first woman's publication by and for women, which has been brought back through the Washington Post recently, documentary filmmaker Agyemang Tekla, who is Italian with parents who are Eritrean and who recently began co-hosting a podcast about Black identities in Italy, states that Since these protests in Italy following George Floyd, she has noticed a rise in the number of young Italians who are interested in learning about Black identities. However, the Italian press has adopted the view that the problems of systemic racism are American problems because of America's history, and they don't apply to the Italian context. There's a tendency to brush off protesters' calls as a solidarity movement with Black America, which is a viewpoint that diverges sharply from the perspective of countless immigrants and Italians of African origin who are saying that problems of racism on Italian soil are pervasive and must be confronted. According to the article in the Lily, over the past 6 years, more than 1,500 agricultural workers of color have died in Italy because of poor working conditions and an absence of labor rights. And over 300 migrant deaths in the Mediterranean have been registered since the beginning of 2020. Also, as I witnessed when I was in Italy earlier this year, I was there earlier this year. I was supposed to be on sabbatical, and I was there from January until the end of March when I had to leave and got one of the last flights out. There is very little reporting on the impact of race or migrant status in COVID-19 deaths. So while it's heartening that so many people have expressed solidarity with Black Americans and Black Italians, the activism needs to endure and to become an opportunity for reflection on and reckoning with what's wrong with the Italian system, instead of pretending that problems of racism only concern other countries. As Audre Lorde said, we must be the change we wish to see in the world. And that applies to us as individuals, as well as the us of our social groups. To many people in Italy, dark skin is considered un-Italian, and Black Italians are pressing and organizing for a reckoning with this narrow, discriminatory, and unjustified concept of Italianness. Black women have to contend with the added burden of gender stereotypes. The labeling of African descent women as prostitutes, which was there at the beginning in very strong ways in the 1990s, has not disappeared. I mean, how could it disappear? It hasn't really been critiqued widely. And it's also important to mention that the citizenship law of 1992 awards Italian citizenship through bloodlines, jus sanguinis, and one must wait until age 18 to even apply for citizenship. Again, you should see the work of Camilla Hawthorne on this. Really focuses on the citizenship. A report during the 2017 and 18 academic year highlighted that 842,000 foreign-born students with residence permits but without Italian citizenship were enrolled in Italian public schools. This past June, and there you go, the statue of a prominent, I didn't realize, Dr. Hill, I thought that looked like the same statue, but it is the same one. I'll tell you about that statue, that was a prominent Italian journalist who volunteered for fascist leader Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And he defended his decision to purchase and temporarily marry a 12-year-old Eritrean girl. That was defaced, as we saw, in support of Black Lives Matter. But the mayor of Milan, where this is, refused to remove it, defending the man's great journalism. There are many fascist statues in Italy, buildings and symbols as well. For instance, the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, built in 1935, is in Rome by Mussolini to commemorate the bloody invasion and occupation of Ethiopia, which would later lead to charges of war crimes against the Italian government. And in 2012, Ettore Viri, the right-wing mayor of Affile, incorporated a memorial to General Rodolfo Graziani, who's also been named the Butcher. He was a Nazi collaborator and accused war criminal, and put this up in a park built with funds that were approved by the center-left regional government. At the head of Italy's chapter of a preservationist organization, as the head of a chapter of the preservation of a preservationist organization, responded when he was asked how Italians feel about living among relics of dictatorships. Why do you think they think about it at all? So to conclude, I believe the decolonization of Italian and French studies is vital for the world that's emerging today. Black Italy is becoming a fluid force for social introspection and positive change towards making Italy a truly just society in the face of a growing tide of right-wing, identitarian, populist messaging. People of African descent are not just curiosities. They are as they are habitually seen in Italy. They are part of Italian and European society. After witnessing the often hostile and treatment as outsiders and exotic or erotic strangers of people of African descent for over 30 years, and studying the colonial influences that preceded the immigrations, I'd just like to express again how grateful I am for the opportunity that Professor Hill and the Department of French and Italian Studies have given me to talk about these matters today, and on such a momentous day in American and world's history. So thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing talk. I learned a lot, and I have to apologize for scheduling you November 4. Like, what a
I
setup!
didn't realize.
I didn't realize initially either, and then someone told me like, "What are you doing? Who wants to give a talk on November 4?" So I hope that it wasn't too. I hope you were able to escape into your talk prep.
That's exactly what I was able to do. In fact,
Yeah.
it really helped me compartmentalize and turn off the news. And so I actually thank you for that, because I sure would have been in a agonized, I would be much more exhausted than I am now. I'm happy to be I was happy to have something to focus on other than, what was going on. So thank you.
My pleasure, and thank you for the amazing talk. I have several questions to ask, but I wanted to start by encouraging students and others who are listening to type. You can just raise your hand, actually. I think if you go into participants, I could be wrong. Or is that how you do it? Or is it the chat? Anyway, you all probably know how to do it already. You can raise your hand. You can just say that you have a question in the chat. You can say that you have a question in the Q&A. You don't have to actually ask the question. You can just let us know that you have one. But let me start off while people are still thinking and processing some of the things you said. I guess I wanted to talk about, I'm going to go off some of the skip the prepared questions, because I wanted to actually hear more about where you think the future of Italian studies is going with respect to these questions, and what kinds of research still needs to be done. Like, what's urgent in your sense as you look at the field of Italian studies? And then after that, we'll go to a question from Lindsay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And in fact, when I was in Italy in January, February, March, I was in Reggio. I heard them talking about decolonizing now. And this was at the University of Reggio, and they were doing a conference, and they wanted to do a special session, which we were going to do in May in Milan, but of course it was canceled. And so, and I had to ask, because it was the first time I'd heard anybody use that language there. And since then, I was just heard that there's another set of panels that are organized, and a conference that they're doing in Italian studies in the United States that are working on this. And I think, there's so much. I've actually had graduate students that have contacted me and talked to various people. And I think, that are now wondering what to work, what do they do for graduate studies? They know they want to work on this. And I just see it as
Right.
a wide open thing. First of all, they need to look at how the lived experiences of people and what they're saying about their lives there. And, and issues of representation in terms of visual representation. Issues of political involvement and cross-pollinating ideas. I mean, I think about Audre Lorde talking about Black Europeans as being the people that may be the inspiration for all of us to follow. This is in the 1990s that she's talking about that.
Right.
All the Black Europeans throughout the whole continent, and I really think that's still, obviously hasn't been tapped into yet, because we're just now. I've had people talk about French, also the issues in France with and are still, hitting resistance among people. But I think, first they have to get over the idea that you can't talk about racism in Italy. So, but it's really wide open. Like I'm in the Africana Studies department. We do everything. I mean, we talk about, we work on everything: religion, social movements, literature that people are writing. I mean, epistemologies, African epistemologies, cosmologies, and so many different, there's so much that's involved in this that I think the same thing can go for Europe and for Italy, and even for Italy and with its own special contributions to these studies.
Okay. Okay. I hope everyone heard that. It's a wide open field. So
it is really.
Let's go to a question from Lindsay. Let's see if we can promote her too. Here she comes. Can you turn your camera on, Lindsay? And there you go.
Perfect. Yes, I just got the settings. Hi, Heather. Thank you so much for coming in and speaking to us today. My name is Lindsay. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm part of Dr. Hill's Black in Europe class. And we were able to read a few of the chapters from Black Spaces. And I was curious, you speak a lot about microaggressions and then also some of the representations of African women in Italy, especially in the media and in different forms of language. So I was curious if you could speak a little bit more to the experience of Black women in Italy that you have seen, and then also if there's any kind of moments of like fetishization that you've noticed. My group is doing some research on that for our final project. So was curious on your thoughts.
So you're doing research on that for a final project is it France or that you're focusing on? Yeah.
In the Italian context, actually.
Oh, in the Italian context.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a very interesting thing that you asked that. I was just, when I first was working on this on Italy, which was in around 1990, when there was the first period of migration, I was talking to women predominantly. My first book is about women, and it was hard for African women, whatever length of time they'd been there, they could talk about this happening to them, and it was continuing, even being ramped up even more at this point, that they would be stopped and asked to touch their hair and propositioned. Okay. And if they went for job interviews, they were often just told that they were asked these same kinds of things, and they were vulnerable in domestic, homes and so on, and there was a lot of demand for work in homes at that period of time. Because women had just started going, out to work for one thing, and in Italian women, and also because there's so many old elderly that needed care, and there weren't many facilities. Anyway, yeah, I mean, the experience of women, they're dealing with these stereotypes in ways, as I just mentioned, and the notion of fetishization, which really is the kind of it comes out of Western imaginaries of Black women's bodies as sexually different from anybody else's body, other women's bodies. And as desired, and especially in Europe, you see this a lot in Europe, as Europeans really do think Europe has imagined Black women's bodies as really beautiful, but in a way that's untouchable because they're considered of a different race, and so and othered very dramatically, and so the women have had to deal with this fetishization, which, by the way, I hear a lot of my students talk about this in the United States. I don't know if that's coming from your own experience, but being fetishized is an experience that happens. I mean, I teach at a predominantly white school, and a lot of my students of color have talked about themselves being fetishized in this context. And yes, they do it there. They do it differently, and so somewhat, but because they don't even, they have more of an awareness that it's okay. or they think it's okay. And so women have those kinds of particular problems. And then they I don't know, they have a lot of difficulties with, they don't have a lot of, they're also very together with each other a lot of times, by the way. There's a lot of activism, as I was saying. They're the people who have been at the forefront of starting different kinds of initiatives. And they were the first ones who, at the beginning, they were getting the jobs much more easily than the men were, because there was more of a demand for certain kinds of labor that they were doing, of domestic labor in particular. And so they were the ones who were making more money, at least and more consistently. You see, African women, really, people of African descent, because I'm thinking about a lot of people that I know who have relationships with Italians. And it's a little, and have really become integrated in various ways, and grew up in Italy or spent so much time there that they consider themselves Italian. So they have less. They never stop struggling to just deal with Italians in ways that they usually just confront them. I've seen them so many times do it. I mean, so I guess I'm saying that, yeah, they're really, they face certain problems that we don't face, but that people don't face here, that they face certain problems, but they do it they do it often in a way that shows tremendous self-confidence and shows tremendous belief and empowerment in ways to just not be stopped by at least a lot of the people that I have been observing and studying. And so the people that are involved in political activity, I don't know how, I know I'm going on and on because I'm tired and it's like late here. And I hope that I've been able to answer it a little bit, because I think that question of fetishization is interesting. I had just this notion of this kind of iconic imagery of, for instance, of Sarah Bartman, which is just this kind of notion that has been inherited in the West as an icon, and that is still being talked about, and that Black women are still, writing songs about in poems and talking, using, doing art in response to and that's a kind of there's a fetishization which is still, exists, but I don't know what else to say about it. Sorry.
No, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And good luck with it. It sounds like an interesting project, worthwhile. Yeah. Good.
Let me ask you about, because we only have a couple of minutes left,
Okay.
let me ask you about your current projects or future projects, where you see your own personal work going from here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I was planning to write, to do a book with Donald Carter, and with actually somebody who's at UC Santa Barbara. Her name's France Windance Twine. We were planning to do a book on Europe. And I'm going to say this because I was in Italy to start doing research on this, or to continue doing research on it. And I wanted to, and why? Part of it was because I've been teaching like this kind of a course for as long as I've been teaching, okay, which is about 20 years, right? And it's now becoming really something that's taught, like you're just offering it now. So I always thought it needs to be, attention needs to be brought to it, because I teach the diaspora. I also teach about the United States, a little bit about the Caribbean, and about the coming from former plantation slavery and a different kind of a history on this side of the Atlantic. But they're very intertwined histories, and people don't think about Europe, unless they want to go to Europe or somehow. And so, a lot of times I thought, it's really important to look at what Europe is. Usually when I've asked students, what is Europe? They will say, it's white, it's Christian. They don't think, and even when they have gone there, they don't notice people who are not white. A lot of people, I'm just saying, okay? And so I thought it was really important to bring attention to that. And so we were going to do this project. This is my view in part, but we all thought it's extremely important. And we wanted to make our own contributions to it in terms of issues of of representation and violence, and lived experience always is what I'm going to be interested in, right? So that's one project which I had to stop because of COVID, and the world has changed so much, really, Professor Hill, that I don't know. The project is going to have to be different. It will, it was going to have to start with what happened with COVID. The other thing I've done is a kind of what I did when I came back and was forced to come back in March is I wrote something which I'm going to continue to work on, which is kind of a story of being an anti-racist white woman, how I became an anti-racist and what does that mean? And because I also run into all kinds of, there's a lot of things that I understand and have experience doing this kind of work in Africana studies, which I strongly believe in and love, actually, as an area. I'm a geographer, anthropologist, but I love Africana studies, this transdisciplinary field of Africana studies. And but, in this world that we're in right now, there's just all this stuff about these, being classified, how one is classified, and we have different experiences. And so I wanted to, and I did write, but I need to continue to work on a manuscript about that and certain experiences I've had teaching this and what's going on in the world right now, and how, I guess how to think about these issues in a bit of a different way, and the way that we are classified, because I do think of race as being socially constructed, but it's also very real, and there's been this notion that white people can't understand this stuff. Mm-hmm. And can't understand racism and can't understand Black people's experiences and this kind of, and I do use Afro-pessimism a bit in my book, but I don't subscribe to the notion that that we're locked in a system that can't be changed. I think that we do change it, and not only, we need to, there are things we can do. I use Stuart Hall a lot of times as my inspiration, as well as Frantz Fanon, the problems that he encountered and he expressed, and Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, and
it's
lots
so
of great
fascinating
people.
to see how you're connected to that genealogy of Black radical thought, and
Yes.
it's so amazing to hear your words of encouragement and hope, and basically the notion that things can change and that things are changing in a lot of ways, and no matter what happens here, work is still remaining to be done. That's for sure.
And we have to do it together. It has to be united. I mean, I think we really need to keep that in mind. And, we need to keep in mind that that people can change, and people do change, and that really there's a lot of people who just maybe they don't understand, or a lot of us, the people don't understand, but people want to understand. The world has changed, and that's my message, is that we will continue on this struggle, because it's a long struggle. I mean, it's always going to be a struggle. There's always a struggle. They're obviously looking at the political situation.
The only thing you can be is a happy warrior.
Yeah, happy warrior. That's exactly it. A happy warrior. I love that.
Well, thank you, Professor Merrill, for your generosity, for your kind words, and hope to hear from you again. Really looking forward to the new projects. Sound really interesting. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Best wishes.
Take care.
Too.
Thank you, everyone.